At 11:47 on a Tuesday night, Elena Whitfield's phone rang 3 times before she looked at it. By the time she answered, her house was already burning. She would later tell investigators that she remembers the drive home only in pieces. A red light she ran without noticing. The sound of her own breathing, too loud in her ears. She does not remember screaming. Her neighbors say she never stopped. 3 children were inside that house. By morning, none of them were. For 6 months, the official explanation was simple. Tragic, but simple. Faulty wiring, an old house. A family that ran out of luck on an ordinary night in early autumn. But one detail never made it into the first reports. An hour before the fire began, a neighbor across the street watched the family's live-in nanny step out the front door, carrying nothing, and paused to look back at the house, just once. She was never seen again. This is the story of how a woman who seemed almost too good to be true became the most trusted person inside a family's home, and why, by the time anyone understood what she actually wanted, it was already too late to stop it. On paper, this looks like a house fire, a terrible, random tragedy that could happen to any family, on any street, in any town. But almost nothing about that night was random. The family at the center of this story is the Whitfields. Daniel, a successful real estate developer, his wife Elena, a former architect who'd stepped back from her career to raise their children, and their 3 kids, ages 11, 8, and 4. The woman who worked for them, the one who vanished before the smoke ever cleared, went by the name Marisol Vega. For 14 months, she was inside that house almost every single day. She knew which child was afraid of the dark. She knew which cabinet held the fire extinguisher. She knew the code to the back door. What almost no one knew, not Elena, not Daniel, not the detectives who took the case in those first frantic hours, was that Marisol Vega wasn't actually her name. And the real question this story asks isn't just what happened that night. It's this: what did Daniel Whitfield do, years before this family ever existed, that made a stranger willing to spend more than a year of her life waiting for the right moment to walk through his front door? To understand what happened, you have to go back to the beginning, not of the fire, but of the family. Daniel Whitfield built his career the way a lot of ambitious men do, fast, and without looking back too often. By his late 30s, he ran a mid-sized development company responsible for apartment complexes, retail centers, and subdivisions across the region. He was the kind of man people described as generous at dinner parties and hard to pin down about business. Both were true. Elena had been an architect before the children came. Talented, understated, the kind of person who noticed details other people missed. Friends say she gave up her firm reluctantly, telling herself it was temporary. It never became temporary. Their 3 children, we'll call them Mia, Noah, and Grace, ages 11, 8, and 4, were, by every account, an ordinary, loud, loving family. Soccer practice, piano lessons nobody wanted to attend, a dog that shed everywhere. Nothing about their daily life suggested anything was wrong. Then, 14 months before the fire, Elena hired a live-in nanny. Marisol Vega's references checked out. Her paperwork checked out. She was quiet, precise, almost unnervingly capable. The kind of person who reorganizes your pantry without being asked, and somehow makes it feel like a gift instead of an intrusion. The children adored her almost instantly. Grace, the youngest, wouldn't fall asleep without her in the room. Noah taught her his favorite card game and insisted she play it exactly by his made-up rules. Even Mia, 11 and typically guarded around adults, started leaving her notes on the kitchen counter. Elena would later tell investigators that hiring Marisol felt, at the time, like the best decision she'd made in years. But there were small things. Things nobody thought to mention until much later, because on their own, none of them meant anything. Marisol never talked about her family. Not once, in 14 months. When Elena asked, gently, over coffee one morning, Marisol simply said her family was complicated, and changed the subject so smoothly that Elena didn't notice the redirection until she was already thinking about something else. She always wore long sleeves, even in the warmest months. Elena assumed it was modesty or a skin condition and never asked. And once, Only once, during a routine fire alarm test that the building inspector ran as part of a home renovation, Marisol didn't just flinch. She went pale, dropped a stack of folded laundry, and left the room without a word. When Elena checked on her 10 minutes later, she found her sitting on the edge of the bathtub, breathing like she'd just run a mile. Marisol apologized, blamed a headache, and never brought it up again. Elena let it go. Most people would have. What none of them knew, what wouldn't come out until months after the fire, is that 8 years earlier, in a different city entirely, Marisol Vega had lost almost everything she loved to a fire that officials called an accident. She did not believe it was an accident, and she had spent nearly a decade convinced that one specific man had made sure no one else would believe it either. That man was about to hire her to take care of his children. The night of the fire began, like most disasters do, with something completely unremarkable, a work event Daniel didn't want to miss. His company was celebrating the groundbreaking of a new luxury development, and attendance mattered. Investors would be there, city officials would be there, and Daniel had spent 2 decades understanding that being seen mattered almost as much as the work itself. Elena didn't want to go. She'd later admit, in a quiet, guarded interview months afterward, that she'd had a feeling that night. Nothing specific, nothing she could explain, just a low, persistent unease she chalked up to exhaustion. Daniel convinced her they'd only be gone a few hours. Marisol, as always, was more than capable of handling bedtime alone. They left at 7:40 p.m. Mia was reading in her room. Noah was building something elaborate out of Legos on the living room floor. Grace was already half asleep in Marisol's arms. For the first 2 hours, everything was ordinary. A neighbor, walking her dog past the house around 9:15 p.m., later told police she saw the living room light on, heard faint cartoon music, and thought nothing of it. At some point between 10:30 and 10:50 p.m., investigators were never able to pin down the exact minute. Something changed. The neighbor across the street, the same one who would later describe Marisol calmly walking out the front door, said she happened to glance out her window around 10:45 and saw the porch light switch off. She assumed the family was simply going to bed early. She did not see Marisol leave. Not yet. That detail, the timing, and what it meant, would become one of the most disputed and important facts in the entire investigation. Hold on to it. At 11:31 p.m., a passing driver called 911 to report smoke coming from an upstairs window. Fire crews arrived within 9 minutes. By the time they got the blaze under control, the second floor of the house was gone. Daniel and Elena arrived at 11:52, 5 minutes after Elena's phone had started ringing with a neighbor's frantic voice on the other end. What Elena remembers most from that night, the detail she has repeated to investigators, to reporters who eventually tracked her down, and to almost no one else, is that the street was already lined with fire trucks, and she could not, for several long seconds, understand what she was looking at. Firefighters recovered all 3 children from the house. None of them survived. Marisol Vega was not among the injured. She was not among the dead. She was, simply, gone. And for the first several hours, in the chaos of that night, nobody even realized she was supposed to have been there at all. It was Mia's phone, recovered days later from the wreckage, that gave investigators their first real timeline. A text sent to a friend at 10:52 p.m. read simply, "Marisol's being weird tonight." No reply was ever sent. In the first 48 hours, the story the public understood was simple and heartbreaking. A devastating accident, an old electrical system, a family shattered by nothing more than terrible luck. Local news ran segments about fire safety in older homes. Neighbors organized a vigil. Nobody, at that point, was looking for a suspect, because nobody yet understood there might be one. That changed when investigators couldn't locate Marisol Vega. At first, detectives assumed she'd fled in panic, terrified and traumatized, and would surface within days. Trauma does strange things to people, but days became a week, and the woman who had lived in that house for 14 months, who had a bedroom full of clothes and a nightstand full of small personal items, did not come forward. She did not call the family. She did not contact police. And when detectives finally pulled her employment records to track her down, they discovered something that turned the entire case sideways. The Social Security number on Marisol Vega's original job application belonged to a woman who had died 11 years earlier. For the next several weeks, the investigation split into two competing threads, and, predictably, so did public opinion. One theory, favored early on by some investigators, centered on the family itself. Insurance records showed the Whitfield's policy on the house had recently been increased. Detectives quietly looked into Daniel's business finances, wondering whether a company facing financial pressure might have staged a fire for a payout that went catastrophically, unimaginably wrong. It was a real line of inquiry, and, for a brief and painful period, one that made Daniel Whitfield a person of interest in his own children's deaths. It went nowhere. His finances, while complicated, showed no clear motive, and no evidence ever suggested Daniel had any knowledge of what was coming that night. The second theory, the one that would eventually prove correct, was harder to pin down because it started with almost nothing: a fake name, a missing woman, a burn scar Elena mentioned almost as an afterthought during a follow-up interview months after the fire, when a detective happened to ask if Marisol had any distinguishing marks. "She had scarring," Elena said, "on her arms. I always assumed, I don't know what I assumed, I never asked." That single detail, old scarring, deliberately hidden under long sleeves for 14 months, sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. Fire investigators, working the scene more carefully now that arson hadn't been ruled out, found something in the wreckage of the upstairs hallway that had been missed in the initial report. Fragments consistent with an accelerant, concentrated near the smoke detectors. The same smoke detectors that, according to maintenance records, had been cleaned by Marisol just 4 days before the fire. It was no longer possible to call this an accident. Detectives began the slow, unglamorous work that solves most cases like this one. Not a single dramatic breakthrough, but months of cross-referencing burn injuries, immigration and employment databases, and old case files involving unresolved fire deaths. They were looking for a woman with real scarring that matched a real fire, whose identity had, for some reason, needed to disappear. They found her 7 months after the blaze, not by finding Marisol Vega, but by finding the woman she used to be. Her real name was Marisol Reyes. And 8 years earlier, she had been listed in an old case file as a surviving witness to a different fire entirely, one that, until that moment, no one investigating the Whitfield case had ever heard of. That older file was about to connect Daniel Whitfield to a tragedy he had spent nearly a decade making sure the world forgot. 8 years before the Whitfield fire, in a mid-rise apartment complex on the other side of the state, a different fire broke out, one caused, investigators at the time concluded, by faulty wiring in a building that had failed 3 separate safety inspections in the 2 years before it burned. 7 people died in that fire. 3 of them were children, Marisol's niece and 2 nephews, ages 9, 6, and 3. Their mother, Marisol's younger sister Camila, survived, badly burned, having run back into the building twice trying to reach them. The building had been developed and managed by a company owned, in part, by a younger, hungrier Daniel Whitfield. In the initial investigation, inspectors flagged deliberate falsification of safety records, documentation showing repairs that were never actually made. A whistleblower, a former maintenance supervisor, came forward alleging he'd been pressured to sign off on inspections he hadn't fully completed. Then, 6 weeks into the investigation, the whistleblower recanted his statement. The falsified records angle was quietly dropped. The official conclusion shifted to accidental failure, contributing factors unclear. No charges were ever filed against the company or against Daniel Whitfield personally. To this day, no public record definitively proves what happened in those 6 weeks. What is confirmed, according to court documents from a later, unrelated civil matter, is that Daniel Whitfield's company made a substantial, non-disclosed settlement payment to the whistleblower's family shortly after the recantation. Whether that payment was compensation or something closer to silence is a question this story cannot answer with certainty, and one the public, at the time, never got the chance to ask at all. Camila never recovered, not physically, not emotionally. 2 years after losing her children, she took her own life. Marisol found her. By every account from people who knew her before that first fire, Marisol Reyes had been warm, unremarkable, entirely uninterested in vengeance. The woman who walked into the Whitfield's interview 14 months before their house burned was not that person anymore. She had spent 6 years learning everything she could about Daniel Whitfield, his company, his patterns, his family, and nearly 2 more years building a false identity solid enough to survive a background check. What she wanted, according to a journal recovered 8 months later from a storage unit rented under her real name, was never simply to hurt 3 children who had nothing to do with any of it. Her own words, written nearly 3 years before she ever applied for the nanny position, describe something closer to a demand. She wanted Daniel Whitfield to understand, completely and permanently, what it felt like to lose everything to a fire and have the world call it an accident. Whether the outcome matched that intention, whether grief that specific, held that long, curdles into something the person carrying it can still fully control, is a question that has no clean answer. Investigators who worked the case, and the few people who ever spoke with Marisol Reyes before she disappeared into her false identity, remain divided on whether she planned every detail of that final night, or whether something happened inside that house that even she hadn't intended. What is certain is this: the look back at the house, the detail from the very beginning of this story, the one witnessed by a neighbor who couldn't have known what she was seeing, was, according to the journal, the only line in the entire plan Marisol had not written down in advance. She never explained, anywhere in her own writing, what that final look back was for. Marisol Reyes was found 9 weeks after investigators identified her. Not arrested, not confronted in some dramatic standoff, but discovered by a groundskeeper at the site of the old apartment fire, which had long since been demolished and replaced with a small memorial garden. She had been dead for at least 2 days. The official cause was ruled a suicide. She left no new note. The journal recovered from her storage unit remains the only real record of what she believed she was doing and why. For Daniel Whitfield, the reopening of the old case brought a different kind of reckoning, not a criminal one, but a public one. The statute of limitations on the original falsified inspection allegations had long since expired. He was never charged with anything connected to either fire. But the story, once it reached local and then national news, did what courts couldn't. His company lost its remaining contracts within a year. Investors withdrew. The development that had been the reason he wasn't home the night his children died was quietly sold off before it ever broke ground. Elena filed for divorce 5 months after the funeral. In the only interview she ever gave, she said one thing that a lot of viewers of this story will likely never forget. She said she didn't leave because she blamed Daniel for the fire. She left because, once she learned the truth about the first one, she realized she'd spent years married to a man who had made a calculated decision that other people's children were an acceptable cost of doing business. And she couldn't unknow that, no matter how much she wanted to, for her own children's sake, go back to not knowing it at all. There is no version of this story with a clean ending. Marisol Reyes lost 3 children who were never given a chance to grow up and never received anything resembling justice for it. No trial, no headline, no accountability, for 8 long years. In the process of finally trying to force that reckoning into existence, she took the lives of 3 more children who had done nothing wrong at all and who deserved, at minimum, to grow up in a world where the people responsible for taking care of them were exactly who they said they were. Daniel Whitfield lost his children, his marriage, and his career, but never faced a single criminal charge for the decision 8 years earlier that started this entire chain of grief. 2 families were destroyed by the same fire, 8 years and hundreds of miles apart, and the man whose decisions connect them both walked away from all of it without ever standing in front of a judge. So here is the question this story leaves behind, and it doesn't have an easy answer. When the system fails to hold someone accountable, and that failure eventually costs other, entirely innocent lives, who bears the responsibility for that second tragedy? The woman who couldn't get justice and decided to take it herself? Or the man whose actions made sure she never had another option? This story doesn't have a villain and a victim, as much as we might want one. It has 2 grieving families, a system that failed one of them for 8 years, and a decision that can never be undone. I want to know what you think. Was Marisol Reyes a monster, or a mother's sister who was let down by every institution that should have protected her family long before it protected Daniel Whitfield's? Was justice ever actually possible here, or was this always going to end with two destroyed families and one man who simply had more money and better lawyers? Tell me your honest answer in the comments. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.